Hi, and welcome everyone to Black History Quest, Oregon Black Pioneers History Research and Conversation Program. I'm, of course, Mariah Rocker, your host for this evening. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to pioneer out and dive into Black history with us. As per usual, we're coming to you live on the Oregon Black Pioneers Facebook and YouTube pages. If you can't stay for the whole show, you can always find this and every episode of Black History Quest on the Oregon Black Pioneers YouTube page. Just look for the Black History Quest playlist. But what is Oregon Black Pioneers? If you haven't heard, we're Oregon's only nonprofit dedicated to preserving and presenting the experiences of people of African descent statewide. Since 1993, we've illuminated this seldom told history through a variety of ways, including books, exhibits that are available on our website, along with lesson plans available for K through 12 for any of you educators out there. And we also do programs like this one. So this is our 10th episode of Black History Quest. Now, for those of us joining us for the first time, thanks to our history investigator, let me explain what it entails. We hire local researchers to act as our history investigators who dive into a source to uncover the history around it. These sources can include objects, photographs, newspaper articles, letters, and more. Regardless of the type of material, each one has a story to tell. And Black History Quest is how we discover what that story is. So each investigator spends months exploring these sources and preparing a presentation on their findings. Every other month, we reconvene here to reconnect with our history investigators and learn about the discoveries they've made. Plus, we take a peek behind the curtain to see what this historical research looks like. Now, after hearing from our history investigator, we'll chat about their findings in more detail. So this is where you come in. Make sure to stick around and leave your questions in the chat section of the live stream so that we can discuss them live on air after the presentation. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. Today, we are super lucky to have Jeff LaLande as our history investigator. Jeff LaLande graduated in 1965 from a then segregated high school in Virginia Beach, Virginia. In 1969, he earned a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University. Jeff later received a PhD in American history from the University of Oregon. He's had a 30-year career with the U.S. Forest Service as an archaeologist and historian, and is now a private consultant in those two fields. Perfect for this sort of role. Now, Jeff has authored numerous scholarly articles published in academic journals, as well as several books. The most recent, The Jackson County Rebellion, a populist uprising in Depression-era Oregon. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to Jeff LaLande. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Mariah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Good to be here.
Yes, so glad to have you. We're really excited to have you as this episode's history investigator, and just intrigued to learn more about what you can share with us. So before I let you get started, all of our Black History Quest investigations do begin with a source that sparked an interest. So if you could just briefly tell us a little bit about what the source was and why it caught your attention, I'd love to hear before we really dive in.
Well, I'll talk about it more early on in my presentation, but I'd say my source was a particular person that I met and talked with many years ago, far back in my Forest Service career.
Oh, okay, interesting. What sort of, I'm curious, I'm excited to learn more in the presentation, but I am curious, what sort of questions did the source bring up? You know, when you interacted with this person, what made you intrigued by what you could uncover?
Well, it was his words that from him, I first learned that there were Black Enrollees in the Civilian Conservation Corps down here in Southern Oregon.
Oh, sure. So it hit close to home. That makes sense.
Yes, it did. Yep.
Okay. Well, cool. Now that we're all certainly intrigued, I'll go ahead and turn it over for you to present.
Okay.
All right.
So, hi, everybody. I'm honored to be here and to share with you what I, as an investigator in Black History Quest, have learned about the Black experience in the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, down here in Southern Oregon. Some 250,000, 250,000 young, unemployed Black men enrolled and served in the CCC nationwide during the New Deal years of the Great Depression. During that massive National Employment Program's 9-year existence, their participation in this program was profoundly affected by racial segregation and pervasive prejudice. In other words, their experience was basically of a piece with what most Black people in America were experiencing during those very same times. First off, I want to thank Zachary Stocks, Director of Oregon Black Pioneers, and Mariah Rocker, Public Programs and Exhibits Manager, for reaching out to me in late 2023 to do this research project with the resulting presentation of this evening for Black History Quest. And especially for giving me the leeway to choose my own topic of interest, the story of Black C.C.C. enrollees in Southern Oregon. Now, that term, Southern Oregon, long used term for what's actually the southwestern corner of the state, primarily Jackson, Josephine, and Douglas counties. I wanted to do some original research into this little known and, alas, what turned out to be a very sparsely documented piece of Black history. This topic is one that had first piqued my curiosity way back in the early days of my Forest Service career as an archaeologist and historian, but until now, I'd never actually had the chance to follow up on it. Allow me a quick bit of personal background here. My entire 31-year career with the U.S. Forest Service, other than a few special assignments to places like Washington, D.C., was on the Rogue River National Forest, which very late in my career joined with the adjoining national forest, the Siskiyou, to become a single national forest, today known as the Rogue River Siskiyou. But that's late in my career. It's headquartered in Medford and located largely in Jackson and Josephine counties. From the beginning, part of my job involved talking with local old-timers, men and women who have now all long since passed on and who usually lived in very rural places, asking them about what they remembered about the Rogue River National Forest from many years gone by, such as early ranching, early logging, early day Forest Service activities, including the work done by the C.C.C. during the Depression. That's the upper Rogue River you see there on the right. One of these elderly residents whom I pestered with questions was the late Marcel Sandoz, who grew up on a small ranch in the very remote, and actually still quite remote, Elk Creek Valley. Here's the upper Rogue River, Crater Lake, upper Rogue River, heading this way. Headwaters of Elk Creek are in this portion of the forest, and Elk Creek drains this direction southerly to reach the Rogue River. Sometime in the very early 1980s, I met with him on Elk Creek and asked him all kinds of questions. At the time, I already knew that the Forest Service had had a fairly short-lived C.C.C. camp in the Elk Creek Valley, and I asked him about it. Among his recollections, Mr. Sandoz recalled that the Elk Creek camp's company of C.C.C. men included, quote, a few colored guys, but the camp didn't last long before it was closed down, end quote. His comments on the presence of Black C.C.C. men in an extremely remote part of southern Oregon did surprise me, but we soon moved on to what the Elk Creek C.C.C. crews were actually doing out in the woods. But Marcel's words intrigued me over the years, and I sometimes wondered, what would it have been like then to be a young African American from some distant place, arriving as part of a large crew composed mostly of white guys in that remote Oregon Valley, one populated by people of modest means, and virtually all of them white. And in Southern Oregon, a region with a long-term reputation of animosity towards Black people. So when Zachary called me and asked if I'd like to select a topic for Black History Quest, I didn't hesitate. Okay, early in my Forest Service career, I learned a fair amount about the C.C.C. in general and about its role during the 1930s Great Depression. Not just the better known examples of C.C.C. work like Timberline Lodge up on Mount Hood, but especially its work and thus its lasting physical legacy on the Rogue River National Forest, building trails, roads, rustic campgrounds, ranger stations, and fire lookouts, as well as fighting fires, planting trees, and so forth. Fish Lake Shelter, shown here just after being completed by the C.C.C. in 1936, there on the right, is still in use, as you can see on the lower left, and is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, as are many of the C.C.C. Structures on the Rogue River National Forest. Here are some other examples of work done on the forest, a warehouse, and there were ranger stations built, and campgrounds, and all kinds of features out there on the forest. I quickly learned that the CCC was President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's favorite New Deal program. Basically, it was FDR's very own brainchild. Here's a jovial FDR with smiling enrollees at Camp Roosevelt, CCC Camp Roosevelt in Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains, with his national director of the CCC, Robert Fechner, there on the left. I learned that it employed a total of over 3 million young men who enrolled from throughout the country and served in every state and territory, working in America's national forests, national parks, state and city parks, and elsewhere. Working between the year it began in 1933, starting only a month after Roosevelt's inauguration, and its last year, 1942, when it was shut down due to our entry into World War II. So early in my Forest Service career, I learned many of the basics of the Civilian Conservation Corps. That it was open to young, unemployed men between the ages of 18 and 25, who initially could enroll for only a single 6-month hitch, but that soon successive multiple hitches were allowed. It was popular. That Uncle Sam provided long-distance rail transportation to CCC camps, as well as the fact that both uniforms and room and board at the camps were provided free, as well as basic medical care. That an enrollee was paid $30 a month, $25 of which he never saw because it was sent directly back home to his hard-pressed, financially struggling family, leaving him with $5, which was more than enough for some bottles of soda pop at the camp canteen, a couple of movies in town, and so on and so forth. And that each camp housed a single CCC company, about 120, 150 men, and that junior U.S. Army officers administered those camps on site. Now, the host agency, as I recall, like the Forest Service on national forests, Park Service on national parks, the host agencies selected and supervised the many different kinds of work projects, and they also employed older, local, experienced men, known as LEMs, to pass on their skills and to supervise the enrollees, from running heavy equipment to pulling on a misery whip, a crosscut saw, to mortaring rocks into rustic fireplaces like the one you saw a couple of slides back. Each camp would have a small library, including recent magazines and likely some second or third hand books, novels, probably a lot of them by Zane Grey. Educational classes were offered at every camp, from reading and writing, if necessary, for those who hadn't yet learned those skills, and there were some, to Red Cross first aid, to American history. I also learned that copies of the National CCC weekly newspaper, Happy Days, were sent to each camp, and that every camp actually had its own little monthly typed mimeograph newspaper, often the result of work done by one or two enrollees who knew or learned on the job how to type. And copies of some issues of those camp newspapers are available digitally. And that when established in 1933, the CCC was racially integrated. This was a profoundly radical step for that time in American history. For example, the U.S. military remained racially segregated until 1947, 2 years after the end of World War II, and nearly 15 years after the CCC had begun. Alas, the CCC's racial integration policy soon proved too radical, if you will, for many, and it did not last. That policy went away. Here are two different integrated CCC crews somewhere in the far west, sometime in 1933 to maybe early 1935 at the latest. Informal indications are that most Black enrollees in Oregon camps came from Chicago and other Midwestern cities, not from the American South. Now, the CCC program also included several veterans camps for older unemployed men who'd served in the armed forces during World War I. Here is the assembled company at Camp Wolf Creek in Josephine County here in Southern Oregon, which, as can be seen, was racially integrated. There were at least 3 Black enrollees there. And this is another one of them here at Camp Wolf Creek. R, initial R, Bruce, a veteran of World War I. This Medford CCC District 1938 map shows the main camps with these little symbols of a structure and a flag here. You can see them all over the area. Here's the state boundary with California. The Medford District includes the entire southern half of Oregon and much of northern California. And you can note, if you could see it, is that Camp Elk Creek, by this time, 1938, is no longer shown. It went away. But Camp South Fork was in existence. And among the camps that were in the area was the Camp Elk Creek about here, Camp South Fork near the town of Butte Falls, was one up near the rim of Crater Lake in the park, one about here called Camp Upper Rogue at Union Creek, or in the Upper Applegate River about here, Evans Creek Valley in this vicinity, down at Camp Rand on the Lower Rogue River, and other places within this map's area. Here are the 2 Rogue River National Forest CCC camps that I'll be talking about some more later. The photo of Camp Elk Creek, or Camp F37 as it was formerly known, is one of only 2 images I've been able to find of it, and they came to my attention during this research. It was situated well up Elk Creek from the Rogue River, where Sugar Pine Creek, which comes down this way right behind these trees, joins Elk Creek, which comes down around this bend and down this way, and they join together and flow on down that way to the Rogue River. The closest community to Camp Elk, located down on the Rogue River itself near the mouth of the creek. Now, Camp South Fork, that's an aerial view, Camp F104, was at this stage simply a former logging camp that the loggers had called Camp 2. And the big new Wisconsin-based lumber company that had been railroad logging on the Rogue River National Forest there during the 1920s went bankrupt during the earlier years of the Depression. And so the CCC utilized this logging camp as its Camp South Fork. It's located about 10 miles east of the little logging town of Butte Falls. And this photo shows the various small cabins that were portable, put on railroad cars, as almost everything was, and transported to the next camp when they'd logged out a certain area. So this was a somewhat unusual situation to be using an existing logging camp for the CCC. Elk Creek, the campsite today, there's nothing there. It's private land. And there's Sugar Pine Creek back here. This is taken from lower down than where the historic photo you saw just previous was taken. And Camp South Fork, after a few years, the lumber company had regained its footing, and it reclaimed those logging crew cabins and some of the other buildings they left at the CCC's Camp South Fork and moved them to their next logging camp called Camp 3. Soon thereafter, Camp South Fork looked, as it is shown here, like any other CCC camp, with all the standard barracks, mess hall, and other structures. The site of Camp South Fork today is slowly being reforested by offspring of the pines seen in the previous photos. But what about Black C.C.C. enrollees in photos from the Rogue River National Forest? During my career with the Forest Service, I came across a number of photos of CCC enrollees on the forest, like these two images. But not a one of those dozens of images showed any Black enrollees. All of those photos showed only white enrollees. And that fact had contributed to my surprise at Marcel Sandoz's memory of the Black C.C.C. enrollees on Elk Creek. That is, until quite late in my career, until I finally just happened to take a much closer look at a small 1933 photograph in an administrative history of the Rogue River National Forest that I'd been using for a number of years to get specific information for a particular year. And this small photograph, I took a much closer look late in the game. And yes, indeed, it's the integrated company that was there at Camp South Fork in 1933. So what happened? The basic question. Answering it meant that I had research to do. And to answer any historical question, generally, one first needs to review the secondary source literature on the overall topic, which is what historians call the solid past work by previous historians whose research relied on primary sources. That is, primary sources are those that are original to the subject being investigated. Personal recollections like that of Marcel Sandoz, primary source. Primary sources also include formal oral histories, personal correspondence, government records, like those held at the National Archives, newspaper accounts from the period, and so on. In other words, many of the same kinds of primary sources that I end up investigating for this presentation. So these are some of the secondary sources that I used for this presentation. For my purposes, some of the most valuable included works by Olin Cole on the Black C.C.C. enrollees in California and Florida, John Salmond, Caitlin Pinkham, and Jess Porter, along with a very informative 2007 archaeological report by local colleagues of mine about CCC Camp Rand over in Josephine County, just to the west of me. From these and other secondary sources, I learned the following. Again, over 250,000 African Americans served in the CCC between 1933 and 1942. During the program's first years, except in the American South, they served in racially integrated companies. Down in Dixie, no integration down there. FDR knew that any such attempt would likely lead to conflict and even violence, and would come at a debilitating political cost to his New Deal political coalition. But even during the initial integrated period in the very early 1930s, a form of de facto segregation was often the norm at various camps. This Washington State Park campground was built by an integrated CCC company. But Black enrollees apparently could swim there only during special separate hours from white visitors. Now, Southern Oregon has a reputation, as does Oregon in general, for its early policies such as racial exclusion in the territorial and state constitutions. And Southern Oregon's always been very conservative in that regard. However, Zachary Stocks has done research that has demonstrated that Jackson County, with Jacksonville as county seat, had the most Black people in Oregon during the 1850s and early 1860s. But this was due to the gold rush. And that was over fairly quickly. And soon thereafter, Southern Oregon became, if not lily white, then overwhelmingly the home of white residents. So, the case of Camp Rand in Josephine County, down on the Lower Rogue River, according to records, 25 colored boys, as it was written, came along with the young white enrollees in CCC Company 1650's arrival at Camp Rand. They come from Chicago and the East St. Louis areas of Illinois. And in a much later oral history interview, one of the white enrollees recalled that these were the first Blacks that many of us had ever worked around. And he remembered that they were not allowed in the barracks with us whites. They were required to line up behind the whites at roll call. Although they were permitted in the same mess hall with the rest, they were served at separate tables in the rear of the building. Now, M.C. Bowen, who was the CCC Medford District Inspector, who reported directly back to Robert Fechner in Washington, D.C., he wrote to Fechner that, quote, recreation for colored enrollees outside of Camp Rand is very limited, as Grants Pass has no colored people and they don't want any. Bowen went on to point out that the same condition prevailed for Black CCC enrollees at camps near Medford and Roseburg. He suggested that about the only place the men in Southern Oregon can go is Klamath Falls, but that is fully 200 miles from here, from Camp Rand. And I can talk about that aspect of Klamath Falls after the presentation if somebody asks that question for me. But by the middle of 1934, the Black enrollees from throughout Southern Oregon had disappeared from those, on paper at least, racially integrated camps. And almost certainly the hard situation at Camp Rand was probably due to whoever the junior Army officer was who was in charge of that camp. And they basically would call the shots on how racial aspects were treated on the camp. The first year of the CCC, there were very negative reactions from local residents to the sudden appearance of Black CCC enrollees in 1934 and 1933 and 1934. There was even an alleged case of arson of a CCC camp in Ohio after Black enrollees had arrived there. So it appeared that some white people living in rural areas in the Midwest and the far West protested mightily to their local political leaders. The swelling outcry arose against having Black enrollees living in their midst, even though those young Black men lived in CCC camps with white enrollees, and they were under the direct supervision of U.S. Army officers. There was also interracial conflict and occasional violence in some of the integrated camps here in Oregon, as well as severe bigotry from some of the Army officers in charge of the camps, as I indicated. So practically speaking, the well-intended and unprecedented effort at racial integration soon became a threat, a political threat to the entire CCC program. So racial segregation soon became the norm, the official policy, as it already was in so much of American society. Now, it's been Robert Fechner who made that decision to segregate in 1934. Who's taken kind of a hit by subsequent historians for that decision. He was FDR's handpicked man to lead the CCC program, which he did from its beginning in 1933 until his death from a heart attack in 1939. He decided that segregation was the only practical solution to continuing the program with local public support in wherever these camps were. And he did this over protests from African American political leaders. Now, Fechner, he was a Southerner. He was born in Tennessee, spent a lot of time in the Deep South as a young man working. He was a labor organizer, a rather progressive-minded labor leader, but he's gotten pretty well hammered by some historians for this decision. And, maybe he was an outright segregationist and was eager for the opportunity to segregate the program. Who knows? There's no biography of him that I'm aware of, but I think on the other hand, you need to realize he was under immense pressure to get the job done, to make sure FDR's pet program was a success and didn't blow up nationally or locally. Now, after the segregation took place of the CCC by 1935, there were all black CCC companies in areas outside of the American South, where there were some all black companies in the South at the very beginning. But there were none in Oregon. There were some in California. So 1934 became the crucial year for my research. Back to my inquiry into the case of Southern Oregon. It's now time for me to look into the primary sources on the Black CCC experience down here in Southern Oregon. My first stop, if you will, was the National Archives. The full name of that agency is the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA, N-A-R-A, NARA for short. This is its original headquarters on the north side of the mall in Washington, D.C., located about midway between the White House down this way and the U.S. Capitol down that way. And it looms like a temple to the nation's past. And indeed, in the main room inside, a giant hall, is like this shrine of the documents of American independence, Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, Bill of Rights. However, most of NARA's central records would not fit anywhere in the building like this, even though it has a huge basement, several underground floors. Its main operations are out in College Park, Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C. And it's a huge building complex out there. And it has a wonderful big reading and research room with natural light. Unfortunately, I could not afford to go there for this project. I couldn't afford to. And anyway, almost all of NARA's CCC administrative records, that is, the records generated directly by the Civilian Conservation Corps agency itself, are yet to be digitized. So it would have been difficult to access, and you could spend days on a fruitless search for something. But I did call the College Park campus and made connection with one of NARA's assistant archivists. Told him what I was after. That is, any information on African American enrollees at Camp Elk Creek and Camp South Fork on the Rogue River National Forest. Could he possibly try to locate something, anything for me? And the results, the only relevant item, he went back into the stacks and poured through some boxes for me and called me back a few days later, was a single typewritten letter written to that Inspector M.C. Bowen, on the West Coast. And this correspondence is from 1935, showing that over 100 Black enrollees had been at some point all present at one time in Camp South Fork, evidently during 1934, sometime prior to this, when this letter had been written in March of 1935. They'd been there at Camp South Fork just outside the little town of Butte Falls, which you see here as it looks today, and it doesn't look very much different at all from the way it did in 1935. Still a very small town. So this was news to me, this letter. It stated specifically that there were 117 Black enrollees at Camp South Fork. So this was interesting. I found nothing else from the main archives. So my next step was to go to NARA's regional archives up in Seattle to go look at Forest Service records from the Rogue River National Forest, Forest Service records that dealt with that agency's dealings with the CCC on the Rogue River National Forest. So I asked the assistant archivist, Crystal Shirley, what did they have? And she told me they have 4 boxes full of CCC files. And, you know, I started licking my chops to get into this material. And so I drove up to Seattle to the repository there in Seattle, which is actually on what was until the early 1970s a Naval Air Station, Sandpoint Naval Air Station. And the repository's building is actually in a big old jet hangar from airplanes from the Naval Air Station that would come and go out this big sliding door, which now has a much smaller one for government records to go in and out of. So I arrived, and those 4 Hollinger boxes were waiting for me on a rolling cart. There were other visitors there in the small reading room researching very different topics from mine. Now, alas, those 4 boxes proved to be a disappointment. Why? Most folders of letters and other records were from after 1935, after the segregation of those initially integrated companies in Oregon, including Southern Oregon. But I looked hard, going through each and every document. Many at least, were monthly forms filled in with numerical data on various subjects, number of sick days taken, and so forth. That basically held nothing for my purposes. However, that's not to say these records were uninteresting to me. I found a number of items that piqued my general interest in the CCC camps on the Rogue River. For one thing, the camp menus gave a good idea on what just the enrollees were eating, and it looks like they were having 3 square meals a day. So disappointing, but the records did prove one of my early stage hunches to be wrong. I had thought that Camp Elk Creek, the one that Marcel Sandoz and I spoke about, maybe it was closed early on because of some sort of racial conflict or protests from local residents. I was eager to go through those records from 1934, and my initial suspicions, if you will, proved out to be wrong. It was closed not because of any racial incidents or such, but a very mundane reason. The absentee owner back in Pennsylvania refused to renew the Forest Service's lease to the bit of private land that the camp was built on unless it met his demands. And the Forest Service, there was a wrangling over the amount of money and other requirements, and it just did not happen. So that's why Camp Elk Creek closed early. Okay, so to summarize, it was a good to actually get my hands on the records for sure. Sources were limited in their value to my project. Really nothing directly relevant to the Black C.C.C. experience on the Rogue River National Forest. Instead, as it turned out, my most informative source turned out to be newspaper articles. There's Main Street of Medford in the early 1930s. Medford was then, as it still is, by far Southern Oregon's largest and most prosperous city. The Medford Mail Tribune was owned and edited by Robert Rule, the guy on the right, something of an aristocratic fellow from an affluent background back east, a Harvard graduate, and politically a progressive voice in a conservative region. He was pro-New Deal, and in the 1920s, he had fought the Oregon KKK when most newspaper editors remained silent during that period to the threat posed by the Ku Klux Klan. Still, there were relatively few stories mentioning Black people at all, let alone in the CCC, in the Mail Tribune. And many of them used the usual stereotypes that were common. Now, early on, 1933-34, the pages of the Tribune featured a number of stories on CCC activities. The CCC was new, still new, and new camps being opened and new companies showing up. Mention of Elk Creek and other camps in and around Medford. And there were a number of stories about the CCC boxing matches and basketball teams. Elk Creek played South Fork. And these did not mention the racial makeup of the teams that I could see, but these events were very popular in the small towns close to these CCC camps. And the games were often played in that small community's school, public school. But there were some stories about dealing with the CCC that did discuss the racial aspect, and some probably caused concern among some Medford readers, such as this alleged riot of African-American CCC enrollees up near Salem. May well have been precipitated by the treatment from the junior U.S. Army officer. Just don't know. There's no reason stated, really. And this story, closer to home, over in Josephine County, south of Grants Pass, a little town of Cave Junction, this happened in Southern Oregon itself. There's no indication of the racial identity of the man wielding the knife, nor the seriousness of the wound. It was precipitated because the CCC camp, which included Southern white enrollees, objected to a Black man watching them at a dance. So there was this story of Armistice Day, November 1933, parade down Main Street in Medford with Black CCC enrollees as minstrel players at the end of the line. So a sample of some of the stories. But by 1934, local implementation of this racial segregation policy in the CCC is revealed in a number of stories. This June 5th, 1934 newspaper story is evidence, direct evidence of Robert Fechner's segregation policy directive in action here in Southern Oregon. All district taken to Camp South Fork near Butte Falls. And 2 days later, a story talking about the all the truckloads of Black enrollees passing through Butte Falls en route to Camp South Fork. And the figure of 117 of them is direct verification of that 1935 letter in the National Archives back in College Park. Now, on September 26, 1934, the Black Enrollees that had been all transferred from the various camps in the Medford district, all down to Camp South Fork, were almost ready to pack their belongings and head back to Chicago and other places. Their enlistments or enrollments were over, and they were about to be discharged from the CCC. The Medford paper announced, however, that boxers from 6 different CCC camps around Medford were then in town to weigh in for the Elks Club's scheduled boxing matches a couple of days hence. And among the young pugilists was Leroy Smith, quote, the 155-pound colored flash from Camp South Fork. 4 days later, a socially revealing article, a rumored race riot in the Mail Tribune. The story debunked the rumor. There was no such race riot that was said to be between black and white CCC enrollees. The Tribune was at pains to point out that they'd been working together for quite some time. And so their departure was marred by this story, unfounded rumor. At the very time that the train carrying the Black Enrollees was already well out of town, carrying them back east. So, remember I said that during my long Forest Service career, with that one exception, that one photo, I'd come across no photographs of Black C.C.C. men on the Rogue River National Forest. To my amazement, in the past year, during my research of this project, several such photographs came to my attention. 3 of them were found in the Klamath County Museum's photo collection over in Klamath Falls, but with no information as to when and where they were taken, let alone who donated them and when. I was asked if I could help identify the location of those images. I could, and I did. I knew the locations where those shots were taken. And then 2 more photos came to light. These came from the Southern Oregon Historical Society in Medford. They're being accessioned into the Society's collection. They were part of a large number of donated photos that have been taken in the 1930s by a local amateur photographer. And starting with the Southern Oregon Historical Society photos, 4 Black C.C.C. men in the back of a U.S. Forest Service pickup. And this, in the other photo, each showed terrain in a forest type that looked familiar to me. Somewhere up in the high Cascades in Southern Oregon, this country was their Shasta red firs, high elevation. It looked like it could be up around Blue Rock. Blue Rock Lookout, fire lookout, was being built that very summer of 1933 by the integrated CCC. And this, by the same photographer, is a place I also recognized. And this pickup is the very same pickup, very same license plate that I saw through a close-up hand lens. And I went out to the place that I was pretty sure it was, and it was indeed Lodgepole Prairie on the Butte Falls Ranger District, a place I've been to many times over the years in my career. Plenty of water, good place to camp, and not all that far from Blue Rock Lookout, where that project was taking place. Later years, during the Depression, the CCC built a fire guard station out there that is still there. So the other photos, the ones from Klamath County Museum, are, to me, even more remarkable. They're more compelling, even poignant images. They seemed like they were taken by a professional with a large format camera. What was going on? Perhaps the CCC wanted to document the experience of these newly segregated Black enrollees, how they were doing in Southern Oregon. I know it because it's at Camp South Fork because the 6-man logger cabins are still there as they were into 1934 and 35. And in a subsequent photo, Mount McLaughlin looms in the background. So these men are standing at Camp South Fork in the late summer of 1935, summer of 1934, after all of the Black enrollees in the Medford district had been sent to Camp South Fork. And not long before taking that eastward train ride back home. Now note the guy in the background. He's wearing boxing gloves. So here are 10 CCC men. Same location, very same location as the previous photo, and there's Mount McLaughlin rising in the distance. So could this fellow wearing boxing gloves be the colored flash, the fast-moving boxer, Leroy Smith? Certainly think it's possible, even likely. And this musical trio at Camp South Fork, the instruments very likely were prized personal possessions brought from back home. Okay, to summarize, this admittedly quite limited research effort of mine, which was limited due in part both to the lack of available archival sources and to the evident sparseness of the local historic record itself, revealed no documentation of dramatic racial events here in Southern Oregon, no major violent outbreaks, no instances of swelling local protests against the Black presence, no actual race riots. So was Jackson County somehow a paradise of interracial brotherhood and good feeling in 1933-34? I very much doubt it. However, things do seem to have been quiet during that time here. There may well have been some interracial scuffles or fistfights and so forth in Jackson County's CCC camps during the 1933-34 period. So far, the record that I've seen is silent. It's possible, is it possible that the Mail Tribune might have consciously put on a happy face in such manners? Perhaps, doubtless, a number of rural local white residents felt concern and anxiety when faced with the sudden realization that they had young Black men as neighbors. And almost certainly, such folks freely used, at least amongst themselves, the common racial epithets and insults of the time. However, I found no letters to the editor complaining about the African Americans' presence in the local CCC camps, and I was surprised at that. In hindsight, I can't help but wonder what the all-white residents of Butte Falls, that little town, would have said as all those truckloads of newly segregated African American CCC enrollees rolled through their town in the summer of 1934 on their way out to Camp South Fork. During my several interviews and ongoing conversations with Butte Falls old-timers over the years, there was no mention by any of them of any African American presence ever in the vicinity. If only I had done this research project before those people had passed on, I could have probed them about it. In summary, based on the lack of memory that I found about it among Butte Falls residents, the brief Black C.C.C. presence there during 1934 out at Camp South Fork for several months seems almost like it never happened. Let's end with these two images, with these two young men. Their silence allows us to imagine whether their experience in Southern Oregon was positive or negative, or more likely a combination of both. And what happened to them after they left? Did the good-looking guy on the left have a girlfriend waiting for him? Did the fellow on the right find work playing his sax in a Chicago club? Did they go on to serve in the racially segregated army of World War II? And later in life, did they think back with some amount of fondness, perhaps, on their days working in the woods and mountains of Southern Oregon? Thank you. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that wealth of information. I know that I personally learned a lot about CCC in general, and certainly, what you were able to uncover about their experience down here. Thank you so much for all of your time and effort put into to creating that presentation.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, yay! I'm very glad to hear that. We love the opportunity to help support people doing this sort of work. So I'm very glad that, as you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, you were able to dive into what you were interested in. That's exactly what we're trying to do. So for anybody else who wants to be a history investigator, if you have a story about Black history in Oregon and you want some support in doing that research, let us know. But back to the questions. I know that I have a lot that have come up, and we've had some come in through the chat. My first question, and it's actually been kind of repeated in the chat, is what kind of structures did they help build? You mentioned the Blue Rock Fire Lookout. Were they part of that process? Did they build that structure?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
They did build that structure.
Black Enrollees and the CCC in general here in Southern Oregon, they were building fire lookouts. They built ranger stations, which are the administrative headquarters in the various ranger districts, which are the subdivisions of the National Forest. They built guard stations like the one in that photo of Lodgepole Prairie, that small structure out in the meadow there. They built roads. They built campgrounds. They built wonderful community kitchens, as they were called, which are like big picnic shelters, very purposely rustic, really cool structures that were used by recreationists over the years. And they're still out there and being enjoyed by people. So they did a lot of construction as well as lots of other kinds of work.
Right. I think some of us are curious, are any of those structures still around? And I'm also curious, did any of the ones built by Black Enrollees end up on the National Register of Historic Places? That's something that I have an interest in personally.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, Blue Rock Lookout was demolished some years ago as part of the Forest Service getting rid of many of its lookouts. They don't need them as much anymore. They couldn't afford to keep them up. There was vandalism and so forth. So unfortunately, a number of those New Deal CCC built lookouts have gone away, and Blue Rock is one of them.
Sure.
Now the CCC integrated companies would have built a structure there at a place called Matthews Guard Station off of Elk Creek very early in the day. So that's one. And I think they were working on the buildings at the Butte Falls Ranger Station in 1933 and 34. So those would have been integrated at that time. My belief, my belief is when the directive came to segregate the CCC in Oregon, the Medford district, that the majority white company that would have been at Camp South Fork was sent elsewhere, and Camp South Fork became the place for all the Black Enrollees to serve out the rest of their enlistment, their enrollment, while they were here before their enrollment was up. While there, I know that they worked on that photo of that warehouse at Lake of the Woods that was shown in that set of 4 that I showed. They definitely worked on that structure.
Oh, okay. Do you know if that's still there?
It's
that
still
structure?
there. It's
okay,
still there.
cool.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So we could go visit that history if we wanted.
Yep.
We've got another question in the chat from Jack, who asks, "What is the K-Fall connection you alluded to?" Which I was also going to ask. So
Yeah,
thank
I'm
you, Jack.
glad. Thank you, Jack, for bringing that up. So this is my take on it. South in Northern California, northernmost California, not all that far from Klamath Falls, less than an hour's drive, more like half an hour, maybe 45 minutes, is a small town of Weed, W-E-E-D, Weed, California. And in the 1920s and 1930s, it had a huge lumber mill and logging operation owned by the Long Bell Lumber Company, which was a southern operation from Missouri, southern Missouri, which brought its whole operation, including much of its workforce, out to California with them. And it was a segregated workforce, so they had African-American employees working in the mill and out in the woods. And those employees, just like the white employees of the company, the nearest place to do any real shopping would have been Klamath Falls.
Oh.
And so they, they would go there and shop, and they became a known presence in the town. The merchants certainly wanted the return in commerce from their business, and it became quite accepted there in Klamath Falls. And there's still African-American descendants of those loggers and mill workers living in Weed, as well as some who live in Klamath Falls today. So I think there was acceptance. The main point I'm making is there was already acceptance there in Klamath Falls.
That helps.
Yes.
I wouldn't want to have to travel 200 miles to get there. But
sure.
It's good to at least know where you can go.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons it was put at Camp South Fork, which is quite close to Klamath Falls.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
We've got another question in the chat from Kurt, who asks if other historians have looked into Black enrollees in CCC camps elsewhere in Oregon. As far as I know, I'm not sure of any, but I wondered if you'd come across any during your research.
Well, that report Camp Rand, west on the Rogue River west of Grants Pass, the report that was done was an archaeological study of what was at the camp in the dump scatter and remnants of structures and so forth. Very interesting, good archaeological report, but they found this oral history interview by the white enrollee and got a lot of information about it. And that is, to my knowledge, the only focused work. And it wasn't focused strictly on Black enrollees. It was just on the camp itself.
I mean, I'm not surprised. That's part of why, there are so many stories that we are still able to dig into today for Black History Quest. And then finally, I have a question from none other than Zachary, who you mentioned multiple times. He's the best. He asks, what do you suppose would be the reasons why Black enrollees seem to have been rarely captured in photos? Do you have any thoughts on that based off your research?
Well, perhaps there was segregation, visual segregation done by the photographers. Just thinking, I'm just, who knows?
Sure.
But as some of those photos showed, they are pictured at other places. They just weren't, except for that one that I finally looked at late in my career, that little photo in that history of the forest. So there is that. One thing that I do wonder is these guys were definitely way in the minority in the camps they were in. And I wonder, just curious, was it in some ways for them a relief to all at that point to be out of that situation and, with each other at Camp South Fork? I know that may not be a question some people might ask, but it does occur to me that maybe, it's you could relax, enjoy yourself more. So just thinking that.
Sure, that's interesting. It's not surprising that there aren't very many photos because a lot of times, as you mentioned, the photographers aren't necessarily focused on capturing that piece of history.
Yep.
And that's why we do the work that we do today. Zachary did want to point out that there are known sources which mention Black C.C.C men in Tillamook County and near Mount Hood as well. So there's probably a little bit of research done there. I can't unfortunately point to the specific researchers for Kurt who asked about that, but feel free to reach out and we can try to connect you with folks if you're interested in looking more into that. And that is an open invitation to anyone. Um, we are kind of running low on time, so I'm gonna go ahead and I had some more questions. I'm not gonna lie, there's more stuff, but just to wrap it all up, I want to go ahead and ask the question that we ask everyone, which is, how has what you uncovered changed our understanding of history?
Well, for me, I mean, the whole process from talking to Marcel Sandoz back in the early 1980s or whenever it was, opened my eyes to the fact that, hey, the CCC was integrated. I hadn't even really thought of that being the case, given the time that it was, the times.
Yeah.
So and learning about the problems that policy encountered and what transpired afterward, that was educational. And for the area itself of Southern Oregon, I think it just, paints another, missing piece in the picture of our history down here. And so that's valuable in and of itself.
Absolutely. We can't see the whole puzzle picture if we don't have all the pieces. So we need this important work to fill in those gaps. So we are really appreciative of all the effort that you went into to uncover more.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it really has been wonderful to learn from you this evening, Jeff. Just want to thank you one more time for being our history investigator and for sharing your research with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, it's good to talk to you, and everyone that joined us tonight. So great to have you. That'll basically do it for this episode of Black History Quest. But I do have to remind folks that, Oregon Black Pioneers depends on the support of ordinary people who believe in sharing these stories of Oregon's Black history. So if you enjoyed this show and would like to support it and the other offerings that we have, please consider a donation to Oregon Black Pioneers using the link below, or go to our donate page on our website. It's the end of the year, so if you're looking for some place to donate, consider Oregon Black Pioneers. But as always, if you have questions about this episode or would like to become a history investigator yourself, please send an email to hello@OregonBlackPioneers.org. And stay tuned for the next episode of Black History Quest in January, our first episode of season 3, where, as always, we'll try to answer the question, how can one source change history? Thank you so much for joining us, and good night.